It is the end of the world as we know it. Is what a lot of us say, and is what has been said for millennia. People predicting the end of the world, the end times, apocalypse. There's a section out of Luke 21. I'm going to read just a section of it. Ready? Here we go. There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on the earth distress among nations, and on the earth distress confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves. This idea that we look around us and we see the signs that the world is about to come to the end is far from new. People have been saying this since Mayans, Aztecs, the French, Nostradamus, plenty of philosophers, predictors, cult leaders, people with too much time on their hands. We don't know. And I guess in a practical sense, when it happens, it happens. And whether you know about it or not, it doesn't matter. But I'm actually here to talk about hope. Let me say that again. I'm actually here to talk about hope. Because here's what Jesus is framing in this. He's saying, you're going to be looking to the sun, the moon, the stars. You're going to be looking to all these astrological things, the ways that you have always viewed predictive measures for the harvest, for the seasons, for whether God is angry or not, whether you're doing well. All these things have been looked to by the ancient people, and how they read the stars, how they read the sun and the moon. And for them, that was helpful for them, maybe. But Jesus is saying, you're going to look to these things that you always have for answers, and you're going to come up short. And he says, because you're going to come up short, there's going to be distress among nations, there's going to be fighting, there's going to be bad stuff happening, not because you're looking to the sun, moon, and stars, but because life is happening, and that's how humans are. We are faulty, and we are greedy and power hungry. And he says, but the Son of Man will come in riding on the clouds. So here's part of where we are. When we think about the things that cause us anxiety or fear today, and when we look to the things and say, oh my gosh, stuff with the wars out east in Israel and Gaza, and the fighting with Russia and Ukraine, and the threats from North Korea and Russia, and all these things, and we add American politics into the mix, and we say, this must be the end of the world as we know it. Maybe that's us letting fear drive the car a little bit. And that's us looking at our modern day sun, moon, and stars to say, essentially, I can't see how this easily gets resolved. I can't see the future, and I can't predict how this very messy and complex system of fear around me gets navigated. And it wasn't much different for the disciples at the time that Luke is writing this. You've got an area, a hotbed that is so fragmented in religious understanding, so fragmented culturally, so much anger and hate and persecution and oppression. And it wasn't hypothetical. A lot of our fears are, what if? It was being lived out in a very, I imagine, scary way. And so part of Jesus talking about this stuff is not hypothetical. He's saying, the divisions that we're facing. How hard life is, how tough it is economically to put food on the table, how the class system continually puts us down, how we are passed from oppressor to oppressor. And he says, but people will be confused by the roaring waves. And I love this because water is one of these motifs in Scripture that is twofold. One, it's helpful. It's purifying, it's ritualistic, it's the way that you wash and invite new purity into your heart or your eyes or your hands or whatever it is. It's a good thing. Baptism. But it's also the symbol of chaos. It's Jonah thrown over the boat and swallowed by the big fish. It's Pharaoh's armies pursuing the Israelites out of Egypt through the Red Reed Sea. It's trying to cross the Jordan unsuccessfully so many times. Water is chaotic as it shipwrecks Paul among the shores while he's trying just to bring some good news and hope to people. Jesus says that people will be confused by the roaring seas. They will see the waves crashing and thrashing and say, this is unable to be navigated. This is something that is so uncontrollable, so angry that we have no hope. And when you think about the oceans or seas, for example, even during a tumultuous storm where the top of the sea, the surface, what we see, what we observe, and what we feel is bananas. That's 1% of the entirety of what the sea is. When we see the anger of the sea, when we see the crashing waves that are throwing us and others off course, all of that noise, all of that power, we make the assumption to say, this thing, this group, these people are all like that, or are like this all the time. Where in reality, the oceans, 99% of them are replete with millions of animals and plants and life and habitats. And underneath the surface, there's life, there's sustainability, and life moves on. Jesus is saying, as you look to these things in your life, for the ancients, the example is the sun, moon, and stars, you will surely perceive distress among nations. Distress is like the word stress multiplied. It's the word stress and then the prefix dis, meaning like even further away from, even further removed, but not in like a healthy way, in like you've got stress and then you've got stress way back here. And stress tends to be twofold. Stress can be physical and emotional. I'm going to lump those together as one. And we know that physical and emotional stretch ages us. That's the gray hairs, that's the wrinkles, that's the ulcers, that's the headaches, that's the eye twitches, it's the weight gain, all these manifestations of what that looks like. But there's a spiritual distress too when our core questions, our core foundations or hopes feel shaken by what Christ might call the confusing but raging seas. When you think about the stuff going on in your life, as you think about the hypotheticals, the what ifs that are related to fear or deterioration of institutions or relationships, war, there's an unsettling of what that means to some of your core foundational questions. Mainly, will this be okay? Will this be forever? And where is God in the midst? In the midst of all these things. And part of what Jesus is doing in this address to the disciples and how Luke writes this is to say, remember not to go off the rails with your imagination of fear. Remember that history is filled with the tough times, but a truism of God is that God never leaves our sides, that there's always another sunrise in the midst of what feels like the darkness. We talk about the apocalypse. The Greek word apocalyptos actually has this connotation of losing your breath. Apocalyptos is losing one's breath And breath in Scripture is this creative, powerful, purposeful force of God, the Ruach. Excuse me. And the Ruach is what creates the world. It's what God's breath passing over the formless void and waters in Genesis. It's the Ruach that separates the Red Sea to allow the people of Israel to escape the pursuing armies of Pharaoh. It's the Ruach that helps fill the lungs, physically or metaphorically, of the people in Acts 2 and has all the people speaking different languages, yet united in purpose. And so, if the Ruach, the breath of God, is what animates and starts life, it's the breath that enters the metaphorical man, Adam, to give him life, the breath of God. Breath from God is the purposeful beginning. And so, if there's an ending, if there's an understanding of what the end looks like as an apocalypse, it's not absolute destruction. It's not an absence of hope. It's when we have lost all breath. The breath of God. And that's not where we're at. And I don't think that's where we're heading. The apocalyptos as a loss of breath is not at our doorstep. God is still breathing. God is still speaking. There is still hope. Part of this question, though, is about timing. And the Greeks have several words for timing. One is chronos, which is what we use. It's what chronological means. It means linear time. Time that we can say 8 a.m. looks different than 8 p.m., and we can measure it in increments by sunrise, sunset, all these different things. But God's timing is a different word. It's kairos. And a lot of times when we think about our timing versus God timing, there's this the depressed smirk that we get, right? We're like, oh, well, in God's timing, maybe something will happen. But it's kind of this playful resentment to say God's timing is not my timing. God's timing is not predictable. God's timing is not reliable. God's timing is not in my control. And I want to challenge us to think about God's timing as not flippant or unreliable or something that should be just dismissed. But God's timing, like God's breath, is purposeful. If we utter a prayer and it doesn't come true tomorrow, sometimes we point fingers at God and say, what are you on break? Union break up there? And maybe we find some solace to say, well, it's God's timing. And that's absolutely true. Many of us have asked the question, well, why did Jesus come when he did? And the answer is kairos. God, for a number of reasons, determined that the atmosphere, the culture, the military presence and salience, the religious divides and unity, all of those things during what will become 0 AD BC, that's when God chose to send Jesus. And for all the years prior, as God watched humanity struggle and succeed, God raised up leaders and military leaders and judges and prophets and kings in all these different ways to help us try and get back into community with God. But for whatever reason, through the kairos, through God's timing, because of God's perspective and wisdom and knowledge, said this will be the time that I send Jesus. Just like any number of events in your life or in the life of the region, your neighborhood, the world, that things happen not in a linear fashion, not in an expected fashion, but when they happen, how many times can we look back and say, you know what, that was the best time for that to happen? Or that was just a really painful thing and I can't rationalize when or why that happened, but I can still move forward. If we trust God's timing, if we start to work that into our vocabulary or into our thinking, into our prayer life, into our faith, that we trust that God's got knowledge and wisdom and perspective that we don't, I think it takes some of the edge off of our high stakes prayers. It takes some of the edge off of that smirking resentment that we might slowly build against God if we don't feel like prayers are being answered in the ways that they should, or if God's not moving, God's not breathing in the ways that we think God should. This is what this whole passage is about. Jesus says, you have spent your lives looking to the sun and the moon and the stars, trying to have a black and white understanding of the how and when things happen. But I'm here to tell you that the Son of Man, the Son of humanity, the Son of you, the champion and advocate for you, the Greek word is the parakletos, the judicial advocate on your behalf when you feel like you and all of your brothers and sisters are on trial, will come in not in the sun, the stars, or the moon, but on a cloud in a way that you're not expecting, to keep you reminded that the breath of God is still breathing, that the creative and purposeful promises of hope are still alive. And so in this passage, Jesus says, so don't let your hearts be weighed down by drunkenness. And I wonder if the implication is, if you feel disappointed that things aren't happening the way they should in your life, and if you feel disappointed that you feel that God's timing, God's kairos is not good enough for you, then you turn to any number of filler options. Drunkenness maybe being one example. Things that you want to fill your life with to supplant, to replace your prayers of hope, your lookings to the future. And of course, it weighs you down. And your head droops. And by the end of this passage, the gospel writer Luke is saying, so keep your head lifted up. In Philippians, it says, keep your eyes on the prize to which God has called us heavenward. Be alert. How many times does Jesus tell his disciples, stay awake? Don't be like a sleeper that you miss it because life might come like a thief in the night. Challenges, victories, they come in an instant. We know this. From good news and bad news, it changes quickly. And even for the ways that it changes over time in a chronological fashion. If we're not alert, if we're not aware, if we're so stuck looking at the sun, moon, and stars in our lives, the things that have always been prescriptive for us, and we don't have ears to hear, if we don't bring our walls down in our heart to perceive the ways that God is breathing, newness, or challenging new pathways, then we might miss it. And the other side of this is how easy it is for us to become numb to all the tough news and challenges that we've faced these past years. All the ways that your family dynamics have been strained in recent years. How friends and family have gone through different changes, how your relationships and financial status and health and all these things are in flux and fluid. And a reminder is that we gotta try our best to keep our heads up, to stay alert, and to not rest on the laurels of the ways that we have decided, well, the sun, moon, and stars in my life always point me towards chaos. When we look at our lives as one great big sea and we only choose to feed the roaring waters and chaos on the surface, that top 1%, and we're just ignoring all the beauty of the other 99%. This is almost a psychological, therapeutic tactic for us. Can we actively work against deciding that the whole ocean of our lives is always some turbulent storm. It's easy for us to get there, right? It's easy for us to look at the news in the world and say everything's chaos, everything's a storm, and it's in the sun, the moon, the stars. This has to be the end. This has to be terrible. And we just get caught in those snowballs of fear. I heard a great quote just recently, and I'll paraphrase it, that both faith and fear are fed by what is not seen. Two sides of the same coin. We don't always have a clear understanding of what faith looks like. And so we feed it through the things that are unseen. We feed it through our prayers, through our dedication, through our practices, our spiritual disciplines of meeting together or taking time alone for ourselves and with God. These things that feed that invisible faith. But fear is the other side of the same coin. And too often we are putting all this energy and thought and words and social media posts feeding the unseen fear. And like faith, it's contagious. And there are too many examples to count in recent years of how fear-based narratives have drawn and riled up entire swaths of people to convince people that fear is the predominant emotion, the predominant reality, to convince them that the ocean is just what you see on the surface, to convince them that the signs that you've always looked to in the sun, moon, and stars in your life will always be that way. And that change is nearly impossible except for drastic and sometimes violent measures. The gospel writer says people will be confused by the roaring waves. They'll miss the bigger reality. People will be so focused on looking to these astrological things that they miss that the Son of humanity comes to offer words of hope and salvation on a cloud. So don't let your hearts be weighed down by the ways that you drink to excess in your life. The drugs that you fill yourself with, the negative cynicism that you surround yourself with too much that weighs you down. Keep your head up. Find the ways to be alert, to recognize that you're ready to see God coming in a perspective that you weren't looking for, to be oriented in a different way than you've been used to, that you don't miss the ways that this life is still one of hope and of joy. And in this Thanksgiving season, we can genuinely force ourselves to name in gratitude the ways that life is good and life is beautiful. Because God is still speaking, God is still healing, God is still breathing in purposeful creation into your life and mine. Let's walk and sing and laugh and create together, brothers and sisters. Peace and love. Amen.